right, y'all. Thanks for joining us for the Risk Management Rodeo, where we're going to talk today about wrangling risks with confidence. We're super excited to be meeting with you today. Just a few logistics to go over. We will have the chat functionality open for Q&A, so please feel free to provide any questions that you might have into the chat. As far as our agenda for today's webinar, we're going to start off with quick introductions of our group of lovely risk experts here today. We'll talk a little bit about risk management as well as what your auditor is looking to see as a part of that process. So especially for those of you who are still learning or new to the risk environment, you can kind of understand what those expectations will look like. From there, we'll definitely talk about how you can actually manage your risk program from getting started to operationalizing this on a day-to-day basis to make sure that you know what your organization needs to do in order to meet your risk requirements. Lastly, we'll talk about building alignment with your executives and stakeholders across the organization and make sure that we're answering any questions that you might have. So again, please feel free to add those to the chat or the Q&A as needed to provide any insight or to ask any questions from our team. So with that, we're going to start things off with some quick introductions here. My name is Molly Mollinger. I'm one of the product experts here at TrustCloud, and I come from the consulting space. TrustCloud is a GRC solution that's designed to help with managing, automating your security and compliance posture and help tying GRC back to the revenue generating components of your organization. I'm joined here today with Taylor and Satya. Taylor, do you mind doing a quick introduction of yourself?
Absolutely, yeah. My name is Taylor Gavigan. I'm a manager here at Danza Durata Susi, mainly in the audit and attestation department, specializing in everything SOC, SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3, all that good stuff. ISO 27001, HIPAA compliance, GDPR compliance, you know, and anything else that you need. You know, they kind of all build off each other, but very, very excited to be here and talk about what I know and learn from some other people.
Awesome. Thanks, Taylor. And Satya, do you mind giving a brief introduction of yourself as well?
Sure. I'm Satya Muteru. I'm the compliance director here at TrustCloud. Basically, that means I do manage our compliance program, but I also advise TrustCloud customer as they work into the compliance journey. My background has been over 10 years plus in audit. I started at Pricewaterhouse. I did external audit there for a couple of years before I moved to PayPal, where I did internal audit, and then went back on the external side to Shellman. So I think much like an auditor, work much like an auditor, and very happy to be here, provide some insight, especially as I've been working on building a program and helping our own TrustCloud customer build their own program. So happy to be here.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for those introductions and really excited to be talking about risk today. So when it comes to risk management, I just wanted to take a few minutes to kind of get on the same page of what is risk management and why it matters. Satya, do you mind going over just a quick overview of what risk management is?
Yeah, sure. And I'm not going to go over the technical definition that we all used to, I think. I like to start by believing that we all have a personal relationship to risk management. We all making decisions every day based on risk, right? Whether we're driving in the car and putting the seatbelt on because we're just driving 5 minutes away or an hour away, right? I do that personally. Or whether we are going to drive over the speed limits, right? Or whether we're going to plan a trip in a foreign country and determine what month are we going to go, right? Is it going to be hot or sunny, or is it going to be the winter time? So on a personal level, we are all very tied and connected to risk. We understand making decisions based on risks every day. So when we talk about risk in a business setting, it's just basically putting a framework around it, right? Because business needs risk in order to grow. A business needs to take risk because if you're not taking risk, you're not innovating, you're not growing. And there's been this kind of one-side view of what risk management is, and that is that it's usually there to stop an organization into getting in trouble or to stop in threat. And that's just one side of it. It's true, but it's not the full story, because there's a lot of opportunity in an effective risk management. There's a lot of opportunity in risk itself. So risk management really is about managing risks and helping organizations make smarter choices and better decisions. So for me, it boils down to this. Risk management primary objective is to help organizations take risk. It really should provide a level of confidence to prevent and mitigate risk if or when they should arise. So overall, risk management should help organizations go faster and make smarter risk.
Awesome. Thanks, Satya. And I think you definitely touched on some of the information around why you need to do it and why it matters to do it well. Taylor, do you mind adding some additional color into why risk management is important for different teams?
Yeah, kind of to branch off there, what Satya brought up on the last few seconds. Everybody assumes risk as a deterrent, right? Why can't we do something? If you measure it right and you kind of address those risks appropriately, you might be able to open up doors maybe that you didn't see before, right? And how you can do something, how you can get something done responsibly, right? While also, managing your appetite for risk. We've talked about it before, but it's a mindset. It's something that from the top down, something that everybody should be thinking about. Not to say, you should be walking around like an actuary. No offense if there's any actuaries on this webinar, but you shouldn't be constantly worried about the risks that are out there. You kind of think of it and you're aware of them, right? And kind of what you have to do to protect yourself and precautions to take, I guess, to navigate the world and the world of business in this case.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And, one of the things that we've also heard from a lot of our clients that kind of serves as that starting point for security and compliance, but it's not necessarily always just focused on that particular area.
As an auditor, sorry. I was going to say, as an auditor, we're, I know we'll talk about it later. We're always, or I'm always concerned about what are you doing, to stay compliant. Show me your process. Show me your documentation around, risk management profile and whatnot. But that shouldn't be the sole focus, to your point.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And I think that's one of the ways that we've seen risk management kind of evolving, as well as making sure that those risk management processes are more robust and more accepted across the organization. Satya, do you mind providing some additional context on how you've seen risk management evolving over the past couple of years?
Yeah. So I think one thing that I'm seeing is that risk management is becoming a little bit more holistic. It's taking a more holistic approach and inclusive approach. And the first thing that I see really is that there's an expanded scope of risk, right? So we're moving from the traditional just financial operational risk to now we're including reputational risk, we're including emerging risk, we're including cybersecurity risks, we're including environmental risk, right? So the scope of the risk at which we're looking at is expanding because organizations have been noticing that these non-traditional risks actually have an importance into the performance. Another trend that we're seeing is that we're seeing a lot more integration of risk management in the strategic planning. So we're seeing a lot of risk analysis based decision being made, right? So that helps prevent risk and mitigate those risks as well. Another big part that we're seeing is the embracing of technology. So companies are using data analysis, machine learning, AI into the risk assessment capability. That gives them, again, a more factual data to work with when they're, again, planning ahead and mitigating those risks. And another trend that we're seeing is embracing the risk culture. A lot of companies are starting early, and they're making sure that there's a growing awareness of risk management throughout the entire organization. So that could be done through training, constant training. That could be done through even when you're hiring a new hire and you are emphasizing on the risk management from the get-go. So we've seen a lot of the risk culture on the day-to-day activity. And lastly is the regulatory changes. There's been a growing emphasis on regulatory framework that do require organization to demonstrate compliance or to demonstrate a strong risk management program. So that is also another trend that's pushing organization into building a risk management program. So it's definitely evolving. It's definitely becoming top of mind into every organization and businesses these days.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And especially when you look at like the SEC guidance around cybersecurity and making sure that risk is being evaluated, it's requiring increased expertise across the board as well, which is a big change from how we've seen things being managed in the past. And Satya, you made a great point about creating that culture of risk awareness across an organization. And I guess, Taylor, that kind of leads me to the next question. Who all should you be involving or considering as the main stakeholders when you're building out your risk program?
Yeah, typically it's, someone at the mid to high, high level management, someone with enough authority and responsibility over the, the related areas, whether it's, the financial realm of the company or the technology realm. Those people should have at least a say and be involved in the process. Now, as far as, assigning certain maybe implementation tasks and whatnot, that, that can be further down the organizational chart, right? You start tasking asset owners and stuff with that responsibility. But as far as the risk itself, who's going to feel the pain in the organization if something were to go wrong, for lack of a better way of putting it, that should be the person that's really has the final say and kind of, this is a really important risk that we have to try to mitigate, and who's going to be responsible for prioritizing those risks, because you might identify more than you can handle at any given point in time, right? So that prioritizing is going to be important, and you need someone with enough authority or responsibility over resource allocation and whatnot to do that.
Yeah, right sizing a risk program is always super interesting because you want to be detailed enough that you're identifying what risks matter to your organization while also being, high level enough that, as you mentioned, you can get resourcing, you can budget. There's things that actually matter and will have an impact. Awesome. And I guess, Taylor, kind of going to the next note, when building out a risk management program, what are the things that you're looking for as an auditor to kind of opine on what a successful risk program looks like?
Yeah, well, we kind of were just starting there, I guess, with identifying the stakeholders or the risk owners. Sorry, my light's shutting off here. Identifying those the risk owners, and in that, right, then you start to formulate or establish a policy, right, or a procedure. Adopting a risk program itself, a framework that you're going to use. And being able to communicate it, like that documentation then is, you can communicate that, and it's transparent enough around the organization, so everybody's aware of it, right? And as an auditor, we love documentation, right? We need to see it. It didn't happen if we can't verify that it, that we can't touch it or see it with our eyes, in the digital sense. But make sure you have some kind of proof of record there. And then as far as actually executing it, we want to see a risk assessment performed, a risk register, and even before that, an inventory list, making sure that you have identified all those, whether it's hardware, software, information assets, anything that, can be threatened, and then impose the risk to the organization if it were to be compromised. You have to identify those things. You can't, or it's pretty tough. You're lucky if you do. It's pretty tough to protect everything if you don't know that you have it in the first place, right? So I would say, in the last bullet here, it's the good, bad, and the ugly. We've come across numerous organizations, that haven't updated their inventory in 2 years, and but yet they've done 2 risk assessments since the last inventory update. It's pretty tough, to do that, in my opinion. But yeah, you go through the process, identify the risks, identify the assets, measure that risk, the likelihood, the impact that risk poses, or that threat poses if that asset were to be compromised, and then decide, do we need to implement certain controls to mitigate that risk to an acceptable level? can we afford to do that? Do we have the resources to do that? Where does that fall on the priority chart, right? And just going through that exercise, that's what we want to see as auditors. Did management have these considerations? Did they talk to each other? Did they think about all of this? And then, after you decide what to implement, that you actually implemented it, right? And that it's monitored. Then you start getting into the risk management, away from the risk assessment, and more into the risk management realm of monitoring those controls and making sure they're doing what you thought they would do, and that they're operating effectively. That everybody in the organization, that it's been communicated to everybody that needs to know those controls are operating, or may be responsible for operating those controls. That they're doing it and that they're aware of it. And then, ultimately every year, depending on the structure of your organization, but if you're a larger enterprise, you have a board of directors, somebody responsible for oversight, it should be reported, it should be communicated to them, a report card and what's been done to mitigate these risks, and what to look for in the coming year or as the company changes, right? Because this doesn't necessarily have to be an annual thing only, right? It could be, quarterly. It could be just as, significant changes to the company occurs. You can do it as much as you want. It's actually better. As an auditor, if we see an organization that goes through 5-6 risk assessments a year, great. I mean, you're really on top of it. I would say that's an outlier for sure, but the more the merrier, as long as they're done completely and with a lot of good intention.
Yeah, I think that all makes a ton of sense. And the risk rationalization over time is something that I've seen be super critical to make sure that you're constantly adjusting. And as you kind of mentioned about frequency, the more frequently you do it, the easier it is to kind of see what your important risks are, what's getting more stale, other information from there. Satya, from your perspective as an auditor, anything that you'd like to add?
I think, well, no, Taylor covered everything, but my perspective as someone who's, been in the audit side for quite a long time and coming into building it and helping other companies building it. I think the one thing, documentation is key, right? As auditors, we won't just believe you. We need to have that reasonable assurance that you're doing it, right? So I think that's usually where a company gets tricked by, because the frequency says at least annually, right? But it's understanding that this is just a guideline. It's just a starting point. And if you are doing it just annually, that means you haven't recognized the value that risk management can bring to your company, right? Because it shouldn't just be a 1-year exercise or quarterly exercise. It should be continuous, just like Taylor said, right? And that's only continuous if you do understand how risk management is related to every facet of your business. Because if it is, then it will be automatic. And at that point, the documentation will go away because it would just be there. It's something that you're doing every day. And it will be very easy. Just like Taylor said, some companies are doing it 4 or 5 times a year because they are looking at it every day. They are assessing there's new risk that comes all the time. As you're building a mitigation plan, maybe your plan includes 5 different steps. Maybe you've done 1 or 2 steps, right? So you need to go back and update the risk register. Or maybe you need to even update your plan. Maybe it's outdated, right? If let's say you were using JavaScript and there used to be a lot of vulnerabilities, and now all of those have been remediated. So at that point, any remediation aspect that you had will go away because now there's a new technology in place, right? So the documentation piece of what your auditor wants to see should be very easy if you're doing this already, right? If risk management is part of your day-to-day, then making your auditor happy or your external parties happy will come very easy because you're not going to be strumming around at the last minute trying to put evidence together. It will be existing already, right? So that's just my 2 piece on my own experience and coming from the other side now and seeing how companies are implementing and working with risk management.
Yeah, if I could piggyback on that, Molly, sorry. Speaking directly to the smaller organizations, the growing organizations maybe that are on this webinar, a mass hiring, right? Or the other side, mass layoffs, you never know. I mean, that's a triggering event. I mean, that's something that, you know, if you go through that, you should start thinking, okay, what does this open us up to? You know, what impact does this have on the organization? You may have just done your annual risk assessment 2 months before that, right? But you probably should do another one. And then, you know, likewise, you know, a larger enterprise, maybe making an acquisition, or, you know, merging or something, you know, that's another one. You know, you should be working through that again. Change in leadership, you know, CEO, CFO, COO turnover, you know, all of that stuff should be triggering events that you know, and sometimes that's planned for, and you know, it's really not relevant, I guess. But if it's unexpected, you know, you should be doing it more frequently than annually.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And I think frequency from the start is kind of something that helps, again, build that culture of risk compliance and just set the expectation that it's something that we do as an organization, instead of having an optional component. And Taylor, on that note too, I know during some of our prior conversations, we talked about how, you know, it's really more than just the CISO's responsibility. It's the CEOs, it's your HR team, it's everyone who's kind of involved in building that culture.
Yeah, yeah. Everyone is a risk owner.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
Everybody has some kind of responsibility, right? Whether it's implementation, monitoring, designing. Yeah, I mean, you can't, you know, if you're vested in the company and you want to see the company succeed, I would be hard pressed to think, you know, the CEO or the COO wouldn't want to be involved in this to some extent, you know, even if it's just to yell at people, you know, be there, you know, it creates buy-in, you know, and it makes everybody kind of feel like everybody's working towards the same goal. And I know it's not, you know, the sexy thing, sales, you know, marketing, all that, but you know, it does have an impact, you know, and it's obviously important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this has been really great discussion around the importance of risk management. So kind of understanding what auditors want to see, why it matters for an organization, who all should be involved. I guess, Satya, from your perspective, how would you see a team really building a risk management program?
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think the answer is going to be loaded, but it's not meant to, because anything I'm going to speak about are things that we've already mentioned in a way, because the general risk process really includes 4 or 5 or 6 steps, right? It's you need to define your objective, you need to identify, you need to analyze, you need to mitigate, you need to monitor, review, right? So these, regardless of where you fall on the spectrum or industry or country, those are going to be the 4 or 5 main steps that you need to be taking into account. But when we talk about getting started, I think it's important to realize that, first of all, every company is unique and they will need an individualized approach to this, right? Some company might say, well, we are in a good spot. Maybe we want to go ahead straight and identify the risk and start monitoring them and mitigating them. Another company might say, well, we may want to start on a training first, right? We may want to build our risk culture first. Another company might say, well, maybe we want to start on policy. I think you get the gist is every company is different, but regardless of where you fall, the company or the SaaS industry, I think if you need to get started in risk management, first start with a roadmap, right? Because a roadmap will give you clear plan of action and step-by-step instruction on how to implement your risk management. It will help you think ahead of time of some of the key concepts that you need to integrate in your risk management. So the first one is adopt a framework, right? And I think Taylor mentioned that as part of what the auditor wants to see, because any of the things I'm going to talk about how to get started are going to feed into the evidence that the auditor wants to see. So as part of your roadmap, first start with a framework, right? There's a bunch out there. There's ISO 31000, there's NIST RMF, there's the COSO ERM principle. Regardless of the one you choose, pick one, right? And then 2, determine how you're going to define or determine your objectives, right? You as a risk manager, risk advisor, or compliance admin, you probably should go work with the CEO or the executive management to understand what the company's goals and objectives are, right? So determine how you're going to figure that out. Is it going to be through a board meeting? Is it going to be through an executive meeting? And if so, maybe set up a meeting ahead of the time. The roadmap is to get you think ahead of time of some of the action that you will need to take later on. Once you find out how you're going to find your objective, the next step is going to be determine your data source, how you're going to identify risks, because that's one of the most important after the objective, right? Because you could look at different data sources, right? You could do risk brainstorming, a workshop where you actually sit with a group of people, a team, a leader, and say, what could go wrong in the responsibilities that you have? What could go right, or what keeps you up at night, right? You could find input from that, or you could also look at historical data. You could also look at industry benchmark and trends as your data source. So come up with maybe 2 or 3 data sources that you're going to look at to identify your risk, right? Another data source could be result of pen testing or vulnerability scanning, right? Know that ahead of time that these inputs are going to be valuable to you. That way you put a process in place to keep yourself updated and current on what those data sources are bringing to you. So that's number 2. I'm not counting the step. Number 4, I think you have to then determine your risk appetite. So as a company, and that's going to be important later on, you have to understand how much downtime, how much financial impact, or let's say non-compliance, regulatory fine you choose to withstand as a company. That will help you prioritize a little bit down later, right? So it's better to know that ahead of time, get the buy-in from management, from executive management, that these are your risk appetite, right? And then later on, next, you want to determine what type of techniques you're going to use to analyze the risk that you're going to identify. Are you going to use a qualitative measure or a quantitative measure? And qualitative is what we kind of mostly use to. It's the high, low, medium. And that's really based on like human assumption, right? It's not really based on fact. It's really based on some assumption, right? Biases in there. Whereas quantitative are going to be, let's say you decide to use actually modeling tools to make your decision, to analyze the risk. And that's using any data analysis, like I said, machine learning. There's a lot of different tools, but you need to determine what strategy or what technique you're going to use when you have your list, your pool of list. Once you have that, then you want to identify, okay, how am I going to determine my mitigation strategy? Who am I going to call in the room to have the discussion with, right? Again, this helps you plan ahead of time when you're having those discussions during the risk workshop, for example. If you've identified in your roadmap that you're going to put into the table or make a mitigation risk owner, someone who's devolved the risk or helped you identify the risk. This is something you want to bring on from the beginning, right? During those risk workshop. That's why having that roadmap is so important. It helps you plan. It really helps you plan your program very well. So once you determine your mitigation strategy, then you can, I think one of the last step that you should do is develop monitoring metrics. What do I mean by that? If you use a qualitative or quantitative, obviously the quantitative is going to give you a little bit more leeway in the performance metrics, right? Because it's actually based on fact and data that you could then look at over a period of time to identify whether or not there were any changes. But if it's qualitative, you also need to figure out, well, okay, if it's qualitative, are there any specific way that I can take to monitor progress over time, or monitor how effective the mitigation that I put in place is working? Because again, risk management should add value to the company, right? If you're not able to monitor and demonstrate to your leader that you're making progress, right? That you can quantify those results in a way that makes sense to the board, then, we're doing window dressing right here, right? So it's, again, as part of the roadmap, think ahead of the time of those performance metrics that you want to put into your place. And lastly, but it's related to the other one, is tracking that, right? Because if you put in performance metrics, then you are constantly monitoring to make sure that you're looking at a trend, the pattern, to see if there's any deviation, to let you know if you need to revise a mitigation strategy, or maybe say that the risk has completely been removed, although that's not necessarily possible. It depends on the type of risk we're talking about. But that's kind of how I would say to get started, right? And this sounds like a lot, but whether you're small or a big company, having that roadmap is going to be crucial. Now, into the implementation of it, I would say if you're a small company, there's no need to go, you don't have to go fancy and buy all the fancy tool, right? Because a lot of things I did say quantitative tools, that does require some fancy tool, but the qualitative measure is there as well. And in the quantitative measure, you could also do a decision tree that does not involve any tool. But again, having that roadmap helps you determine and make those choices. So if you're a small company, you could start with an Excel document. Taylor and I will tell you, as part of audit, we see a lot of risk register based Excel document, right? That clearly capture some of the steps that I talked about, having the objective, the risk that you've identified, the mitigation, the risk owner, and then the monitoring of that, right? And then as you grow, you can expand on that. But that's I can keep going on and on about this, but because the process, the risk management process, really, again, 4, 5, 6 steps, it's not rocket science, it's in the implementation of it that we are challenged, we're facing challenges, right? Implementation of it, and then the seen value.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And I love the idea of setting up a roadmap, because I think one of the challenges that I've seen a lot of clients running into is balancing effective program and a doable program when they're, getting started with risk management. Taylor, anything that you would want to add in as best practices when it comes to getting started with risk management?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna piggyback on what Saya said. She covered all of it, I think. I'm gonna harp on the, when you're deciding, or if you're gonna use both, usually use one. But if you're deciding between quantitative and qualitative, again, a big part of this is the buy-in, right? Is management going to buy into this? And a way to get that, to happen is to associate risk with dollars, right? It's money. Like, how is this going to save the company money? How is it going to make the company money? And if you can do that in your evaluation, so at the end, when it spits out a result about, the residual risk and what you've done and what it's cost you, to mitigate that risk, and what it saves you or what it's going to make you. If you can present that, to management, if you're the one doing it and management's not involved in the actual assessment process, or to the board or whomever, it needs to have that information. It just makes it that much more valuable. So try to think about that when you're working through your risk assessment, your risk register. Nominally, what does this do for us? I think it's, it can't be understated, can't be overstated, rather.
Yeah.
There's my light again.
Yeah, and I know one last thing that we kind of talked about as a part of this conversation as well is really identifying not only which strategic objectives the risks are aligned to, which will help with kind of communicating out to the right stakeholders, but also starting to define the different types of risk and, managing the risk categories, so to speak, in a centralized location. Any thoughts you guys want to add around risk classification?
Yeah, I mean, for me, all of that goes into how you prioritize also your risk, right? Because it's important to classify your risk based on the impact that it has. If it's a risk that is directly tied to your strategic objectives, and usually I see companies start with those first before they go down the operational or the project level based type of risk, right? So one thing I like to say is with risk in general, you classify them by their impact. And then when you prioritize them, right, based again on, like Taylor said, based on the financial impact or let's say the regulatory fine, let's say if there's non-compliance, that's an uncertainty that's non-negotiable, then maybe that risk might rank higher, right? So you could use all those, the financial impact, the regulatory impacts. You could look at your risk appetite to help you classify the risk. Obviously, you always want to start with the one that are directly impacting the strategic objectives. Although I could make an argument that all risk will impact the strategic objectives, because strategic is the high level. But for that high level strategic to work, you need to come and trickle down to those individual projects that then are those action-based that then feed into that strategic objective, right? But if you're just getting started, this could be overwhelming. You can end up with a risk register with 200, 300 risk, right? So that's when classification becomes very important, using your risk appetite, looking at the financial impact, the regulatory impact. But also, I think what's important for what I would suggest a small company to do is focus small, right? You don't have to hit all the risk. Take a small portion of it, right? Maybe it's you want to do 2 or 3 risks a quarter, and really hammer down on those risks. Find out the root cause, right? Because what I've seen in some of the risk register, we're not really seeing the root cause of the risk. We're just putting some band-aid, and what happens is the risk stays in that risk register forever. Really, we don't see a lot of progress. But start small, right? Pick a couple of risks a quarter and work your way through, right, your entire risk, right? So as an auditor will actually be really happy to see that you're taking this approach, because that means that you have a strong intent, you're focused, right? And because you're showing you want to really see value in your risk management. So that's how I would think about risk classification. Your risk register will be gigantic if you're doing it right. But that doesn't mean you need to mitigate everything all at once. Pick a small portion and work your way through it.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue to kind of going into operationalizing risk management across the program as well, because I think that kind of starts small and expands across an organization. So I guess, do you guys mind walking through just how you would go through evaluating a particular risk item, and maybe using a simple example?
Yeah, sure. Let's use data breaches because they're a hot topic. Every company should have them in the risk register. And every company is kind of susceptible to that, right? So to start with the identification, probably something I would look at my source, right? I would go back to my roadmap. What are my data sources, right? So perhaps one of my data sources is industry trend. And just like I said, phishing data breaches are pretty hot topic. So I will have identified that as part of an industry trend. I could have also identified this as part of, let's say, a penetration testing result, right? So perhaps in my data source, I'm looking at historical data, of the company. I'm looking at internal assessment result of the company. So as part of looking at those results, I may realize that as part of the pen testing, there was some entry point that could lead to unauthorized access. Another way for me maybe to identify is, well, I'm looking at the result of the phishing test that I send monthly to the organization and realize that we're not doing so well, right? And because, again, I know that data breach results of phishing tests, at least 80%, then that may raise a red flag and say, okay, well, I need to pay attention to this because we're not doing so well as an organization, and this could lead to unauthorized access. So this is how data breach could end up in my risk register, and those are kind of 3 ways I could have identified it. If I go to the next step, unless Taylor, you want to take this one?
Sure. Yeah, so you would just go into more detail, right? Like what's the threat here? You know, what could happen? What does it impact? Can you just describe, the assets impacted, who would be responsible, who owns that, those assets, that class of assets, or that particular asset. Maybe it's just one. And you kind of just, again, provide an overview to anybody. Again, this register should be viewable by everyone that's relevant, that has importance to it, in the organization, right? So everybody should be able to take a look at this and understand, how you work through this process for this specific risk. I don't know, other than that, for description, Satya, if you have more on that.
No, that was perfect. And then the next one, estimate, right? And this is where I would either use a qualitative or quantitative measure that I've chosen, right? So if I'm going to the qualitative, I may say something that okay, it's high. Again, these are the human assumption, right? It's not really based on fact. It's more something that I feel into it. I don't. And then if I were using a quantitative measure for estimate, maybe I might do a decision tree. I like the decision tree because that doesn't necessarily involve a tool. It just involves me looking at a different way of identification and think about all the possible action or that could happen because of that, right? So if I take the phishing, okay, well, one decision could be, okay, well, if who could have been breached? If it was an employee in the marketing team, what type of access did they have? Where could that lead, right? If it was someone who had privileged access, where would that lead? So then you can kind of think about how that decision tree would help me see the gravity of the risk, and I'm using French here. So that's how you could estimate, right? You use either the qualitative or the quantitative to arrive to a risk score that is either tells you or inform, like Taylor said, right? It's not just you, the risk managers, who's reading this. It's going to be communicated, right? So you want, as part of the estimation, convey that sense of either urgency or importance, right? And then the mitigate part, which is the next part, you can come up with a mitigation strategy. Again, based on the roadmap, you will have identified how you want to take care of strategy. Do you want to bring in risk owner and formulate a plan? And that's probably a good idea, to brainstorm with everyone involved, right? Again, if I look at my identification and I know that, my phishing tests have tested poorly, maybe my pen testing came back with a bad score, or my vulnerability testing. So I bring all these people in my strategy, and maybe some of the output might look like this. Maybe we want to do more training, more phishing training tests for the employee. We want to do more training so that they're aware, because again, 80% of data breach happens to phishing. Another output might say, maybe we want to implement a DLP, a data loss prevention, that is filtering any information leaving the network, right? Maybe we might even go further and say, we want to do more patches. We want to look at the pen testing and remediate any of the entry and exit point configuration changes that's needed. Maybe we want to do more regular testing. Maybe we want to even implement more stronger authentication, right? So the mitigation is going to be a collaboration, brainstorming with some of the identifier that were in the room with me. And that will kind of help me then assign the risk owner. And I know that I keep going. But Taylor, if you want, I can push those to you.
Yeah, and I apologize. I was on mute because I had this really loud air conditioning fan here, so apologies in advance. But there's other responses, right? Maybe in a good way to talk about this during this exercise is maybe you choose, in this particular instance for a breach, you choose not to mitigate it just yourself, right? Maybe you transfer some of that risk of breach, the financial impact, to an insurance company, right? You take up cybersecurity insurance, or you choose to just accept the risk. Probably not likely in this scenario, but or you could just simply avoid it, right? You could say, well, we're exiting that business. We're not going to take any sensitive data. But again, it's probably, if that's your entire business, you're not going to do that, right? So you got to try to think of controls like you were talking about to bring that residual risk down, whether that's mitigating it, yourselves through controls, or outsourcing maybe some some monitoring or assessment activities, or transferring it with insurance, are the typical responses there.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Taylor. And that pretty directly answered one of the questions that we had in the chat around what drives the decision to use risk transfer versus risk mitigation. I would say it's not binary between transference or mitigation when it comes to making that decision, but it's really making sure that you're evaluating what the appropriate treatment is of that particular risk, and what makes sense for your operational strategy, what makes sense for how you're operating your business on a day-to-day basis, and how are you evaluating where that risk is going to come into play. So I think with that, I know we've covered a lot of this slide, and I know we covered a little bit on monitoring earlier, as well as communicating with stakeholders. Any other key points on managing that risk assessment process that you guys would like to cover before we hop into the next slide?
Nope.
Awesome.
I'm on mute. I apologize. I would just say the monitoring portion, when you can, it's a struggle more so for smaller organizations, but for the larger organizations, try to always, it's ideal if you can separate, the responsibility of implementing, these controls and operating these controls to those who actually monitor it, right? You want that to be a different person or a different group ideally, just something to keep in the back of your head.
Yeah, it's almost creating that segregation of duties as across the organization as part of your risk component as well. And then I think the last thing to touch on, just as we're going through this, is that as with everything, I think we've hammered on it a few times, but communicating to your stakeholders to get that buy-in across the organization is really critical, and it helps with that documentation component of it as well, to make sure that as you're showing your work as you would in your math, as in your math class in school, on how you kind of got to those risk conclusions, is helpful to kind of describe why you're making those appropriate conclusions.
Yeah, and the communication piece becomes easier too when you have found a way to quantify the results of the risk management. So for me, that's kind of where I think, again, as a company, we need to evolve to. I think some companies are doing it, but we all should be doing that. We need to find a way to have metrics that we can report on that are easily digestible. We said not everybody's a risk owner, not everybody's a risk manager, right? Not everybody has that rabbit hole understanding of what risks are. They understand at personal level, at some level, but that communication should be very clear for someone to see where we started, where we are ending, and the value that the risk exercise brought to us.
Absolutely. And with that, one of the ways that we've walked through operationalizing risk and communicating is through software and solutions. So one of the things that we wanted to share today is a little bit about how TrustCloud can be utilized for some of that communication. Abir, do you want to kind of share a little bit around the TrustCloud component?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me on the call, Molly. Perfect. Can everybody see my screen? All right, great. So, would love to talk through how TrustCloud customers can use Trust Register, which is our risk management solution, to operationalize risk management. So we'll start out with identification, and I'm going to look at data breach as an example here. But all our customers start out with a standardized catalog of risks that have been curated by our team, and that serves as an initial point of action as far as identification goes. And based on that, we've identified data breach as a risk, and we've identified the source as a phishing attack, given how prominent those have become. We start out with describing this risk. So what is the name? What is the impact? Where does it come from? When was it created? Who owns it? Just some metadata around the description, where we really add context into what the risk is and how it's really going to impact the organization. We move into the estimation portion now, which, as Satya recently mentioned, organizations should move to a more data-driven, a more business impact-driven approach for risk. And we're introducing components around financial impact, as well as more traditional inherent risk calculations that help with estimation. The goal for all of this is to provide customers a way to quickly estimate what a risk would be or what its potential impact is, as well as what the likelihood really looks like, or how frequently will this risk actually pop up. And our goal for this is to be showcasing the business impact of it rather than just showcasing, a subjective very high to very low metric, because that helps with budget conversations, that helps with explaining to the rest of the organization, and has downstream communication impacts as well. Once you've described the risk, you've got your estimations in place, you've understood what the risk's impact is, now comes the fun part of actually mitigating it. And there are a few different approaches that our customers use. The number one approach is bringing controls in. Risks and controls are heavily connected, and we take this relationship even further at TrustCloud by allowing our customers to bring in all of the controls that our catalog represents and use them to drive effective mitigation outcomes. So in this particular situation where we've got phishing attack, for example, as the source of data breach, I'm noticing that my control set is missing phishing simulations. So I'd love to be able to go in and bring some of the more phishing simulations into this and use that as a control to help me track whether risks are being mitigated or are reducing over time or not. So we've added the simulated phishing attack control, but we can clearly see that the control is still in an adopted state, or sort of still is in a planned state. And by introducing it against the risk, we have the ability to say, okay, compliance folks or team members that are part of this, I have a risk for data breach that caused through phishing. I've developed a control to help mitigate that risk. Now we need to start implementing and enforcing that control. And that becomes your roadmap for what standards and what controls you need to enforce over time. Going back to the actual risk, you're able to see the data in real time as far as what control is working or not. And this goes back to our philosophy of risks will not really wait 6 months to show up. If you've done a risk assessment today, that doesn't mean it's going to not become a problem tomorrow. And as a result, we're building the solution to be as real time as possible so that any control failure, any change in risk, you get notifications through tools like Slack and Jira that allow you to take real time data-driven insight for your risk rather than having to wait till the next assessment. Of course, once the risk control portion is done, there's obviously a component of it that may be left behind, and there are treatment plans that you can enforce. And this goes back to that question around transference. Not every risk will have a control or be mitigated. In some situations, you may want to just transfer the risk to an external insurance provider and use that as a primary vector for treating the risk. So in a nutshell, that effectively is how we would assess the risk within the TrustCloud ecosystem. And I want to touch on 2 additional points that both our panelists, all 3 of our panelists have actually mentioned. The first one is ownership. Risk ownership is absolutely critical. It's not a one-person activity, but having a person who's responsible for that risk ensures that it is being mitigated to effective levels within the organization. And we believe in the democratization of risk. So we want to invite as many people as we can, bring as many risk collaborators and owners into this so that it's not just one person and one risk manager who's responsible for managing 250 odd risks. The last and final piece of criticality as far as risk management is the monitoring component of it. So our dashboards are effectively designed to answer a few core questions. The first one is, am I better off today than I was yesterday? And by historically tracking all of our risks over time, we're able to confidently say, how is our risk profile changed? And is the work that I'm doing effective in mitigating the risk that my organization has? The second key question is, do I have the appropriate budget to actually mitigate some of these risks? We see financial impact being one of the core drivers for how risks are mitigated, and showcasing what its financial impact is, what the impact controls have, as well as the budget allocated and requested, helps our professionals paint a picture to their boards and CEOs to say, this is how much budget I need in order to successfully mitigate this risk. Otherwise, here's the impact. And last and finally, we want this to be as real time as possible. So if people are missing risk assessment dates or are not completing actions within the allocated time, they are workflows that will automatically remind you to say, hey, risk owner, you have not completed your assessment in time. This is the impact it has in the organization. So this is just one example of how TrustCloud and Trust Register is helping our customers implement and operationalize some of this risk management program and empower each and every one of you to be trust champions at your company as your GRC program goes. That's pretty much it on my end, Molly.
Thank you so much, Beer. Thanks for that demonstration. And with that, as your team is going through and setting up your program, one of the most important things to do after that is start building alignment with all of your stakeholders and with your executives. I know we've touched on it a few times today, but Taylor, do you mind walking through some of the best practices around socializing your risk program and making sure that the entire organization is rowing the boat the same direction?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? There was some feedback, I think.
Sorry about that. So I was just going to see, what are your
anyway.
thoughts around building alignment across your organization?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to harp on it, but it's just getting the relevant people involved, appropriate level of management involved, and, making sure everybody's ideas are heard, and that you're touching on, the financial side of the business, the technological side of the business, the operational side of the business. And not to jump back slides, but don't forget about what you have outsourced, right? Like the vendor risk management portion of things too. I do want to mention that because I don't think myself or Satya mentioned that, and it's important. But yeah, I mean, it's advantageous, for these smaller young companies to start now to do it. It's while you have a small nucleus of people, and you do have that buy-in that we keep talking about right at the onset. It's easier to do it, and you build it early, and then you just scale it as your business grows. So, again, discussing it often, we talked about that at length as well. It's not an annual thing. Most compliance frameworks and whatnot say annual risk assessment, but aim higher, I guess I'll say. If I can channel the inner auditor here, and building relationships, again, goes back to the departmental thing, and don't be afraid to reach out to, and I'm the auditor, but reach out to organizations, like TrustCloud, that have some tooling and have some valuable insight into how to do this, for varying sizes of organizations.
Yeah, 100%. I think you touched on everything here, Taylor. It's so important to start early. And if you are a small organization, if you're just beginning, great, right? Start with that risk culture, right? Implemented in every part of the business. I think it's a lot harder once you're a little bit bigger and have to start from that strategic objective down. You can do that. Obviously, it's a good way to start. But if you are brand new, just have a few people, it's really embedding everything into decision making, right? I mentioned how projects, everybody, even if you're on a marketing team, on a sales team, have projects that are tied to the strategic goal, right? Whether it's marketing and looking for new customer because the strategic goal is to grow revenue, right? They are correlated. So even at that level, you have projects, and at that point is, how can we make decisions that are risk-based? Whether we're going to pick a specific vendor, Taylor talked about vendor-supplier relationship, so important. And so, and vendors and tools alignment come a lot when we are working in project. We sometimes have to go buy a tool. Think about it in a risk perspective, right? Some risks are not relevant. It's not every day. We don't wake up thinking about, am I going to brush my teeth tomorrow? It's a decision, but I don't have to think about it because I have to do it, right? So it's not every risk that we have to have a risk analysis about. If it's irrelevant, we don't spend time on it. But if the outcome is uncertain and it's an outcome that matters, right, then we want to spend time on it, right? So if you're buying a tool, or let's say you have an investment, you want to, and you have different alternative option, it's important to evaluate those options from a risk perspective. Start early. And if you do start early, and let's say it's implementing your job description, like I said earlier, where you, as part of responsibility, your employees are required to make risk-based decision. If it's part of your communication, then building those relationships comes easier because the risk management discussion is happening often, right? And it would just facilitate the alignment. And I see that we're up on time, but that's kind of a couple points I wanted to add there to end.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for those additional points, Satya and Taylor, on building alignment and helping work together with your team. We're super excited about what this means across the program. For everyone who's on the webinar, we will have some additional resources that will be shared with the team, so you guys can have some more information on how to set up and build your program. And if you're interested in any additional information, please feel free to reach out to your hosts. Thank you so much, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.